There you go. Oh, look at that. It's like it'd be a tobacco auctioneer. I get to pick who gets to go first. Why don't we go over here because the microphone's closer, then we'll go with you next.
Okay. My question is in regards to freedoms and boundaries. Our society today is anti-boundary, and society seems to reject Christianity and the boundaries. Yet society is embracing Islam, which brings with it the boundaries of Sharia law. Can you just comment on that? It seems very confusing and doesn't really seem to have an answer.
Great question. And in fact, doesn't that highlight the culture of confusion, where we want to reject some things because they create these boundaries, but we're actually in favor of things that have way more. I mean, I remember as a Muslim, you're told how to pray, where to pray, what to say when to pray, what to wear when to pray, how to put your pants on. Actually, there's laws about which leg goes first. Tons and tons of restrictions and rules, right? So isn't it bizarre that Western culture, which is on this trajectory, seems to embrace that? A couple of reasons why I think that is. The first reason, I think, is because it's exotic. C.S. Lewis, in the Screwtape Letters, has Screwtape writing to Wormwood, the junior demon he's trying to train on how to get Christians away from the enemy. Of course, and the enemy he's referring to is God. So Screwtape writes to Wormwood, he says, play on their horror of the same old thing. Think about Western culture. We hate the same old thing. I mean, think about the pace with which devices come out. iPhone comes out, iPhone 2, iPhone 3, iPhone 3S, iPhone 4, iPhone 4S, iPhone 5, iPhone 5S. Now we have an iPhone 8 and an iPhone 10. There was never a 9. We have this horror of the same old thing. I can't keep this one. It was great when I bought it, but it's been 2 weeks, for heaven's sake. It's obsolete now. We have this sort of geometric pace at which we want change and new things all the time. So we hate the same old thing. In our culture in the West, Christianity is the same old thing. It's the dusty belief of people with powdered wigs and cinched corsets of the Victorian era. And we don't want any of that. We want new and exotic. That's why you see an influx of people who love the New Age. That's why Oprah Winfrey peddles The Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle's book, and it sells millions of copies, even to Christians, by the way, though basically Eckhart Tolle's book is just Hinduism and Buddhism mixed together and then packaged to you in Western-sounding words. Islam is becoming a very exotic thing. Now, we're not necessarily embracing Islam in the terms of people becoming Muslims, although that's happening. It's not like a mass conversions happening all over the place, although it is growing in this country. It's our sympathy for it. In other words, we will allow Muslims to be Muslims, but we don't want Christians to be Christians. What's interesting is the fact that in many ways, this is the interesting thing, on the marriage issue, for example, except for the polygamy that's allowed in Islam, they believe in no same-sex marriage, but they didn't speak up about it because they couldn't endorse the monogamy part. So they were considered underdogs, and America loves underdogs. We started off as an underdog country. We were fighting literally the strongest empire in the world for our independence, and we won. We love that's why we love Rocky movies. So Islam is Rocky, and Christianity is Ivan Drago or Apollo Creed. And that's part of the problem, is that we don't see things in terms of factual truths. We see things in terms of the story, of the narrative. And so Muslims are a minority, and so they have, and now look, we also make a difference between Islam and Muslims. Muslims are people for whom Christ died. Islam is a set of beliefs. You can disagree with this while still valuing the people. You can still do that. The problem now is that we're starting to devalue the people as well. So what I want to caution against is we see this sort of sympathy towards Islam, but I come from that background, and I can tell you, having enough family members who are in that, they don't feel so sympathized with all the time. I mean, there are mosques that are vandalized, and there are sideways glances at women wearing hijab, and there are all these kind of things. So they don't exactly feel sympathized with all the time either. I have to have a healthy, balanced view. I think the reason is because we value the underdog, and we think Christianity is the same old thing. What's the cure for that? I think the cure for that is this, is to show them that Christianity is radical and it's different than every single thing else. You know, Wormwood was told, play on their horror of the same old thing, give them something exotic and new and enticing. But take a look at every religious system in the world, every religious and non-religious system in the world. Take a look at Islam, it's works-based. If you do enough good things, you'll please God. Judaism, it's work-based. If you do enough good things, you'll please God. Hinduism, if you work off your karma through a cycle of death and rebirth, you'll eventually attain godhood status. Buddhism, if you work off your karma, you'll eventually attain nothingness. That's the whole goal of Buddhism, to attain nothingness. All of these systems require you to do things that fix you. Christianity alone says you can't be the solution because you're the problem. And it says God alone is the one who you don't prove yourself to, but he proves your worth to you by reaching down and picking you up and saving you. You need a Savior who's not you to save you from yourself. Even atheism tells us that there's no higher power, man is the measure of all things. Through our own ingenuity and good works, we will eventually engineer a utopia-like existence like Star Trek, and that's how it'll go. All of those religious systems are fundamentally different except that one way. Christianity is distinct from all of them. So they are the same old thing. It's Christianity that's unique. So if you want to be counterculture, if you want to be a rebel, be a Christian. Great question. Yeah, you did. Yeah.
My husband, Scott, and I are young adult leaders for Community Bible Study, and we're in the Young Adult Corps. And this past summer, we interviewed our young adults and asked them a series of questions, but one of the biggest ones was, how do we make Jesus relevant to other young adults? And they didn't really come up with very many answers, and I'm wondering how do we do that?
It's a great question. I think that you're already on the right track. You ask them questions. You ask them about how to make it relevant. I think one way to do it is to actually ask them, how is he relevant to you? So I think oftentimes we want to think of them. How do we make it relevant to young adults? So if you're asking the young adult leaders, or even the young adults themselves, how is the gospel message relevant to your life? Before you ask it, how can we make it relevant to them? Well, how is it relevant to you? Now, you might be shocked to find out the answers, like, well, I was raised a Christian. Like, okay, well, now what do you do with that? Because they're not being raised Christian anymore. But oftentimes you see how it's relevant to your own life, and you can communicate that to other people. I think one thing postmodernism taught us that I think was actually valuable, a good thing, is the importance of story and narrative. And I think millennials and younger actually value story. Where do I fit in? So if you give them a bunch of truth propositions, you were a sinner in need of a Savior, Jesus is the Savior, he died on the cross, and therefore, that's a set of truth propositions. You can also tell the exact same truth propositions in the form of a story, which is what the Bible actually is. From start to finish, it's a story with some law and some poetry and some historical evidences shoved in there. So you give them the importance of the story, and they suddenly realize, I see myself in the story. I think that's one way to make it relevant. But here's what I would say as well. This is the culmination of all this. Oftentimes, it's a noble goal. It's the right goal to make the gospel relevant to the people. And oftentimes we have to inform ourselves of things outside of the Christian, bubble is too strong of a word, but outside of Christendom. The Bible is the true word of God, but it is proved true also by outside sources. See, the Bible isn't relevant to the culture. In other words, the culture doesn't think it's relevant, but it really is. And they're deluded into thinking it's not because they think it stands against everything else. I think one way to make it very, very relevant to the culture is by showing all the things that they care about in the culture are actually corroborated by the Bible. It was Blaise Pascal who said, men despise religion because they fear that it may be true. The cure for this is to show them that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, he says, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show them that it is. How do you make them wish it were true? By looking at what they actually care about. Maybe they're scientifically inclined. Maybe they're artistically inclined. Maybe all these different things. So how does the Bible and science match up? How does the Bible and art match up? How does the Bible give you freedom to do wonderful and inspiring art? What does it mean to be human in the first place? Are you really just a gifted chimp or a meat computer? Or are you something more than that? Play on the things that they actually care about. That's why Paul the Apostle says in Colossians chapter 4, in verses 5 and 6, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. In other words, find out what they care about and talk about that. letting your speech be gracious as though seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. Not each controversy, not each question, not each issue. He doesn't say answer questions. He says answer people. None of you are in the question answering business. All of you are in the people answering business because people need questions answered. Questions don't need answers, but people do. So find out what they care about first and speak to that. If they're into sports, speak to it. Paul speaks about sports. There's almost not one topic you can think of that's not, as I say, tangentially or directly spoken about in the Bible. He talks about athletes and what it means to train and all these things, commitment, moral values. So find out what they care about and see what the Bible intersects it. But the third thing I want to say to you is this. As noble as the goal is to make the message relevant to the people, you can never forget that the Bible sometimes turns it on its head. Is that the Bible's message, contrary to secular humanism, contrary to the culture of confusion, contrary to every other religious system, says this. It's not that the message is relevant to you, it's that the message is that you are relevant to God. And the cross is the statement that your moral choices matter. If they didn't matter, there'd be no cross. You actually affect the Almighty with whatever you do, both good and bad. How more relevant could your actions be to the world than you affect the creator of the universe? And he's got to act on your behalf. So I think if you make it relevant by seeing what they care about and then showing them that the message is that they are relevant to God, I think that's when it actually begins to turn around. Is it easy to say? Yeah. Is it hard to do? Yeah, but it isn't impossible. I've seen it time and time again work. Great question. Yep. Question over here, then one in the back too. Oh.
Hey, just thanks for coming, by the way. Huge fan of the RZIM.
Me too.
My brother Joe kind of brought me here, and
Oh, great.
Josh is a huge fan of RZIM. He's turned me on to a lot of that lately, so appreciate you both.
Pleasure.
I've watched some of these college Q&A sessions, and they're kind of funny. And what I've noticed is you get a lot of repeating questions.
Yep.
Like even over the years, if you look at them, same basic questions. And I'm curious on what type of advice you would give and what type of questions that you've been asked recently at some of these, even these local colleges. That way all of us can kind of know what the public is looking for.
Yep.
And how to prepare a good defense for it.
Yeah. You know what's interesting is that back in the day, apologists used to get up on the microphone and they would be asked questions like, how do I know Jesus rose from the dead? How can I know I can trust the Bible? Science and God, how old is the earth? All these questions, right? Now it's actually shifted. Those questions are still being asked. But what's shifted now is its meaning. Suicide, sexuality. It's all social issues that have now taken the fore. The other questions matter in the sense that if you can prove that Jesus is who he said he was in terms of the facts, it will bolster your argument as to why the Bible says what it says. But what they want to know, what they want to have is their preferences catered to. But even though, and I said it during my talk, they actually in some ways are willing to be challenged. They're looking for the challenge. So I think it's mostly meaning questions. So I think we have to be well versed on why does the Bible say what it says about sexuality. Let me give you an example of something that happened to me recently to give you an example of what not to do. I was speaking at a camp. I did two things a day. I was speaking in the morning on an apologetics course I was giving to the campers there. Campers, that wasn't like Boy Scouts. I mean, it was like a family camp type of thing. And then in the evening, I was giving the devotions and the sermon every day, twice a day. A young man was coming to every one of my talks on the veracity of the Bible, science and faith, creation of the universe, all these different things. And his parents walked up the third day and said, hey, our son's been coming. I'm glad he's coming because he's an atheist. We raised him as Christian, but he's an atheist, and we have no answers for him. I said, well, what does he ask you? And they said, he doesn't. I'm like, he doesn't? I said, well, he used to. Like, well, what happened? They said, well, son, this is what we believe. We don't ask questions around here. It's all faith. He says, I'm a military guy. I was sort of raised that way by my military father. I joined the military. We just do. And we believe in the higher good of what it is, and we see our place as simply, I said, well, can I tell you something that I think might sting a little bit, but I hope you take it in the right spirit. If you want to make your son an atheist, you're doing a good job. Because if they can't ask you questions because either you shut them down or Oftentimes, even if you invite questions, they don't ask you questions because they're afraid you have no answers. They don't want to embarrass you. So where do they go? I asked this young man, where do you go for your answers? Not kidding you, not kidding you. This is what very bright kid, by the way. This is what he said. The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, late night television, YouTube, and Reddit. So I said, have you read one book by an atheist or a Christian responding to an atheist? He says, no, not one. It's like, well, sorry, but your objections are flimsy, and I'm going to show you why. And we had an hour-long conversation. I said, anything else? He says, no, that pretty much covers the waterfront. Saw his dad at an event. We were in another state. Happened to see his dad. I said, how's he doing? And he says, you know what, he's in Bible study now. Said, it's the power of answering questions. So I think that the sexuality issues, you've got to know why the Bible says what it says. Don't just say, it says it and that's all there is to it. Don't just say that. Read the words, by the way. You actually read them right in. The reasons for the restrictions on sexuality, for example, are actually in the words. It's not, don't do this because it's an abomination. That's what it says. But read the whole context. And then even when Jesus is asked about marriage, for example, they try to trap him by saying a woman was married to a guy, he dies, his brother comes, he dies, his brother, 7 people, which is ridiculous, but they say this. Well, the Sadducees don't believe in resurrection, so they're saying, well, whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? And all these things. He says they're not either given in marriage nor all these things. We're like the angels. And then the Pharisees try to trap him on marriage as well and say, Moses gave us a writ of divorce, but you say you can't divorce anybody unless it's adultery. What's the difference? How do you reconcile this, Jesus? And he says to them, this is where the words come from. You can see why the Bible says what it says. He says, did you not read? He's talking to people who read it every day. Have you not read that in the beginning he created them, not male, them. Male and female he created them. In his image he created them. Male and female did he create them. He used the words a couple of times, them. Why? Because he was telling them the male and the female both bear the image of God in their femaleness and in their maleness, not in their humanness alone. The humanness bears it, but a female bears the image of God because she's female. And a male bears the image of God because he's male. So God calls himself Father. He's the Son. But he also says, "O Jerusalem, how I long to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not come." And he talks over, in fact, the Bible refers to him in a motherly sense numerous times throughout the Old Testament. So we see this essence of who God actually says you are. You bear his image because you reflect him. That means something, that why God says you can't split the genders apart and then exchange one for the other is because when I do that, when I exchange out my wife, who is physically, psychologically, and spiritually different than me, and substitute her with someone just like me, I lose something. And she does the same for me. You can see it in the very words of Scripture. And then you look at the science behind it. And there was an article, I don't recommend necessarily reading it. It was a great article, by the way, by a homosexual man called The Epidemic of Gay Loneliness. And he basically points out, since the Obergefell decision, which legalized same-sex marriage in this country, gays have not gotten happier. They've actually gotten more and more lonely. And they're even nastier to each other than they used to be. Now, there's a lot of language in that I don't recommend in that particular article, but it's very, very insightful to show that we often look for systems to help us, political systems, institutional systems. These are valuable things, don't get me wrong, but we have to know why the Bible says what it says. They may disagree with it, and I'm fine with that, but at least they should disagree with the real thing. Don't disagree with the caricature that the culture tells you about it. You've got to represent him well. So I think sexuality is a big issue. Meaning is another big issue, because in the universities, in the high schools, my daughter is 11 years old, just turned 11 years old. She has an atheist friend. I mean, how many of you had atheist friends when you were 8? My daughter knows one. It happens, right? And the reduction, we're just monkeys or we're just this or whatever it might be. That happens. And so no wonder they ask questions about meaning. What does it all mean? Well, if you're just a conglomeration of atoms, what do you mean? You mean nothing. So we have to answer to these issues because they do have a deep longing and sense of meaning. But they're being told over and over again that you're just either gifted chimps or chemical computers. Well, how does a chemical computer have any meaning whatsoever? You got to respond to that in the meaning question. So sexuality, meaning, and then the suicide issue is linked to the first two. If you're just a machine that's propagating DNA, then why not abuse other people? Why not look at pornography incessantly? And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but the studies show that those who look at pornography incessantly are far more higher risk to commit suicide than the average person, because they begin to see themselves as it's just meaningless now. So we're seeing that as well. Then you bring in the questions of the Bible as well, and you actually they ask the questions. At Yale, most of the questions that were asked of us were on the resurrection of Jesus. I'm not sure why exactly, they just were. An inordinate number were on the questions of the resurrection, how can I know it, the Bible's veracity. And also the social issues as well, but those were the ones. But I say by far now the emphasis is on the social issues. So we really have to know these things. I recommend anything by Os Guinness. He's ever written on this stuff. Ravi wrote a great book called Jesus Among Secular Gods, just came out a few months ago. And the book, and the thing I just talked about, my book, I'm writing this now, it'll be out in May. And we'll talk about these issues as well. But I address all the big questions that we're getting asked at the universities and beyond. You have a follow-up?
I just wanted to say I think we've done a poor job as Christians with science. I grew up, my mom was kind of Catholic, and we kind of migrated to a Baptist church, and it kind of went open-minded more on. And what I found out is that the more you embrace math, the more you embrace science, we don't have anything to fear. It's going to take you to God if you do it with an objective mind.
Well, I'll tell you this. I couldn't agree more. Let me just say this. There was an open forum I was doing. A friend of mine was actually doing a talk on science and faith. And we had a Q&A. And I joined him for the Q&A. He did a great job at the open forum. I did Q&A with him, and a young atheist was there saying, religion is a science stopper. It's called God of the gaps. Wherever there's a gap in our knowledge, we just plug God into it. So why does it thunder? Oh, because Zeus is throwing thunderbolts at the earth out of anger. Why is there tornadoes? Oh, it's the God's finger going through the whatever. And we sort of say, no one believes us, by the way. I've never known one Christian to say, well, God did it, don't explain it. I've never known one Christian to do that. When you think about Gregor Mendel, you think of Johannes Kepler, you think of Tycho Brahe, you think of Isaac Newton, you think of Galileo Galilei. All these different people, they actually believed that God had created everything, and they wanted to figure out how. All the fathers of science. I said to this young man, I said, faith is a science stopper? He said, yeah. I said, you know what, the Bible never actually says this. In fact, in Proverbs 25, verse 2, again, if you know your word, you see these little gems pop up at you. Proverbs 25, verse 2 says, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of kings to seek it out. God is not interested in spoon-feeding you all the evidence because he knows the delight that comes from discovering the evidence as well. If you have a child and you've ever seen a child learn how to read something in your presence, or you've seen them discover a fact or suddenly snap it in their mind and get it, the delight that attends to that child, that's from discovery. It's not from spoon-feeding, that's from discovery. But of the two of you, who's the more delighted? You are. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. He delights in your discoveries because you delight, but he delights more than you do. And we had a literal fulfillment of that exactly not too long ago when the eclipse happened. Good example. Do you know why we have perfect solar eclipses? It's because our sun is 400 times farther away from us than our moon. Did you know that our moon is exactly 400 times smaller than the sun? So we have uniquely perfect solar eclipses. So the disk of the moon covers the disk of the sun perfectly. Now, no other planets in our solar system and no other planets we're aware of in the universe have that ratio. How bizarre is it? How coincidental do you have to be to have the only planet with life on it where life could actually observe scientific facts, be the one place where this happens? And by the way, did you know this? So Einstein's theory of general relativity posited that light would actually, that gravity would actually bend space-time around a massive object like the sun. So gravity actually bends, matter actually bends, I should say, in mass, bends around a massive object. So when light hits it, it'll bend Like when you have a glass of water and the light goes through it and the light is dispersed, that's what happens with a massive gravitational object. Well, we theorized that there were two stars behind the sun, just off to the side within its corona. We couldn't see them because it was too bright. So when the perfect solar eclipse happened, it covered the disk of the sun perfectly, so we could learn more about the sun's corona because of that. And we finally saw those two stars. And you know what we confirmed? That the light from those two stars bent around the sun. It is the glory of God to conceal something because it is the glory of kings to discover it. It literally happened. He literally concealed the sun so we could see everything else. So I think you're right. Science is an endeavor. We need more Christians who are involved in science because you can't even do science unless there's a God. Because if you are just a chemical reaction machine, you don't think, you just react. But if you are something imbued with a mind, then you can do science, because science requires inductive and deductive reasoning. Great observation. Another question here. I'll repeat it.
I am curious how you were educated and also how you educate your children, and if you want to comment about progressive education and indoctrination of our children.
Yep. Yeah, sure. So the question was on how I was educated, how my children are educated, and do I have any comments on sort of the indoctrination I see in the education system today. So I'll say this. I was educated in public schools. I went to a public university, University of Michigan, for my undergraduate in psychology and my law degree. Definitely had a liberal bent to it. All that stuff did. But I also, in order to get my education in terms of my theology training, my history training, and all these things, applied what I learned throughout the course of. I'm also bent this way. I have a penchant, as it were, for evidence and argument and how these things work, so I look for it. And I would take advantage of the graduate libraries. I didn't have studies. I minored in comparative religion, but I looked hard as I could in my undergraduate years for additional information on who God actually is. And then in law school, I did the same thing. And then when I was a lawyer, I did the same thing. So some of it was self-education. My kids go to public school. We happen to have a great public school system where I live. And by the way, a strangely inordinate number of Christian teachers, which is cool and providential. But that's not true of all public school systems, obviously. Before my kids got into school, we talked about what would be our strategy to deal with it. So we talked about our strategy. And our strategy was our kids will never be afraid to ask us a question. And they will never be afraid to disagree with us. If teacher says X and I think Y, I want to know why teacher said X and what their perception of it actually is. So if my son comes home and says, well, they taught us that we came from Neanderthals, Australopithecus, Piltdown, well, not Piltdown man was considered a fraud, but other things. I don't just say, nope, wrong, nope, sorry, son, nope, that's wrong. I don't do that. Okay, did they give you evidence for that? Why that was? Well, they showed these different forms, and it looked like us. I'm like, okay. They show you that little picture where it goes from this thing to this thing to this thing to this thing? Yeah. So did they show you that there's none of these things are actually human? There's no gene similarities? They didn't talk about that. Like, ask them about it. See what they say. But don't do it in front of anybody else. Talk to the teacher afterwards and say, hey, I heard this. Can I ask you a question? Because you don't want to embarrass the teacher either. And challenge them. So ask us any question, no matter how hard it actually is. I want you to ask me questions. Last night, good example. Last night, my son asked me a question about fate. Do I believe in fate? Or do I believe that God orchestrates everything and determines everything? Or do I believe in human free will as well? Not light conversation for me and my 13-year-old to have before he goes to bed. And my 9-year-old was sitting right there, and she wanted to know, yeah, how does that work? So I encourage them to ask the hardest questions they can ask. I want them to. I want them to tell me what's going on in the school system as well. But then I teach them methods on how you can actually interact with your teachers and with the students that are there. But I also teach them, it's not just the science stuff, it's actually the social education. So one thing my kids and I do, we have a game called Spot the Truth, Spot the Lie. So we watch TV, right? And we have a game where I say, okay, commercial came on, or the TV show's on. What was true about that? What was good and true about it? 'Cause it's not all lies. And they say, oh, this and that. We'll watch a commercial for the Lincoln MKZ, okay? What was true about that? That probably gets 23 miles per gallon. They probably were right about that. What was wrong about, what was a lie about that? If you drive it, you'll be as cool as Matthew McConaughey. right? Yeah, yeah, they're a little weird, aren't the commercials? But anyway, so they see this. We're watching a TV show, and I said, it's not always obvious. You got to see it, either in the culture or in education. Watching a show, it's one of these talent shows. And they always do the backstories, on the certain contestants. The ones that have the coolest backstories are the ones who typically progress through the show. And they're talented. So it's a story of a guy, very good-looking guy, extremely talented singer. He grew up, he said he was gay, grew up, he was very, very overweight. And he was picked on for being overweight and for being gay. So a terrible situation. But he blossoms into this, very, very handsome, very, very talented man, and this weepy backstory. And he's a hero on the show. They go to the next person. It's a transgender comic. And he talks about how he just has he can't tell man and women jokes because he doesn't know how to tell those jokes exactly, and he's not taken seriously, and his career's been very tough. Also a very soppy backstory. The next story is about a Christian couple. Now, they didn't say they were Christians. They just said, tell us your story and all this, and they say, well, we're a band, we're a husband and wife singing group. We were kicked out of our church because we had a baby out of wedlock. End of story. It goes on. I said, okay, wait, stop. Spot the truth, spot the lie. What was true about that? It's wrong to make fun of people for being overweight and for being gay. It's wrong to make fun of people because they have gender confusion and they struggle with this stuff. What was the lie? The church is awful. You see what they did? Heroes, villains. These were victims. The whole backstory was they did, in fact, get told to be off the worship team because we have to deal with this. It was dealt with. They were welcomed back. And they even said later on, it was their faith in God that got them through the toughest times. So you see the spot the truth, spot the lie? So the indoctrination that happens in the educational system is sometimes subtle. It's very, very subtle sometimes. Whether it's overtly through the evolutionary teaching that's there. Now I tell my kids, I want you to learn Darwinian evolution. I want you to know what it says. I want you to know the best arguments in its favor. I don't want you to combat the straw man, because what have you done? You're not done a straw man. It's not a real man. If you're going to address it, address the real thing. I would never want atheists to pick on a caricature of Christianity. If you're going to reject it, reject the real thing. So I want them to assess the real thing. But the indoctrination does happen. Whether it's independent thinking or no independent thinking, your feelings are more important than anything else and all this stuff, I think that does happen. There's a great book called Incarnational Humanism where a guy goes into the educational system and he says, what the system is meant to do is to not get people to think independently and vaunt them as independent thinkers. It's to fool them into thinking they're independent thinkers when it plays to their preferences. So they become emotion machines. And so it narrows it down to one point of view. Now, in order to combat that, you can withdraw altogether from the public school system, or you can sort of do what we're doing. Now, I'm not saying do what we do. I think there are great private schools out there, Christian schools, that are doing a wonderful and fabulous job of engaging the real arguments. So they're not creating a bubble. They're creating a real set of engagers. We don't do that. That's how we do it. That's the philosophy of our education. So, and I bring everything I can possibly bring to the table on these things because I'm not trusting someone else to my kids' education completely. I do to some degree, of course I do, but not 100%. That would be my answer to you, right? We got some over here. You guys you're not curious at all.
Hey, Abdu, we are called to have a...
Where are you?
Right here.
Oh, there, okay.
We're called to have a defense for the hope is within us and to do it with gentleness and respect.
Mm-hmm.
And you said up front that you were unoffendable. And, you know, I think as Christians we make a mistake. We tend to get offended by some of these questions that come at us or take personal attack to it. How do you get yourself to a place where you can just say, I'm unoffensible?
Yeah. A couple things. I take a look at who I was before I was a Christian. I remember that there's no us and them. Christian evangelism, you know, and you've heard this statement before, I'm sure. It's bumper stickery, but it's really, really true. Christian evangelism is about one beggar showing another beggar where the bread is. You're still a beggar. You need the bread as much as the other beggar does. So there's no us versus them. you realize that you were once them. Now, if you're raised in a Christian home and you had the blessing of being able to talk Christian ethics and values from a young age, you might be easily fooled into thinking that they are just awful people. But recognize your own failings, because you're going to do it yourself plenty of times. Even though you're in Christ, you're still going to have these failings, and you got to recognize that within yourself. Second, realize something else. Our war is not against flesh and blood, but it's against spiritual strongholds and principalities and powers of the air. This is what it's about. These people, not those people, these people, meaning right next to you, these people are actually enslaved to something that's out there. Yes, there's human agency involved, and human evil is a real thing, but there's also a spiritual domination that happens. And we need to recognize that these are not enemies to be vanquished. These are people for whom Christ died. Christ could have vanquished all of us, me included. And if I were to look for true justice, I would be on the receiving end of that justice just as easily as the next person would. So how can I ever say that they're worse or worse than me? So when they ask me a tough question, and sometimes they're not just tough questions in terms of content, they're not worded so graciously either. You got to realize something. You don't represent you. You represent Christ, who literally said, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do." How in the world can you do anything but the same? He was being literally nailed to 2 boards after having been whipped and spat upon and mocked. And someone asks us a question and we get offended? How in the world do we justify that? Now, you're human. Don't beat yourself up too much about it. But I get, my dander gets ruffled a little bit, but I have to remember, I have to calm it down. They're asking, why are we surprised when lost people act lost? What I'm really surprised about is when Christians act lost. And that bugs me a lot. And I'm looking at myself in the mirror too. I don't want to indict anybody here and say that you're the one and I'm the Mr. Righteous one. I'm not saying that at all. I've had my failings too, where I've been even on a public stage and I've let my emotions get the best of me because of the mannerism in which someone asked a question. And I can tell you this, that happened one time. I was at a open forum, and this young atheist kid asked me a question. He started getting a little arrogant with me and said, "Well, you need to read more." I said, "Really, what? Give me an example. I want a title and I want a name of an author that I haven't read." He said this, like, read it, this one, read it, this one, read it, read all that stuff. Let me give you 15 titles. I rattled them off like that, showing him how smart I was. And I didn't do it to make sure that he came to Christ. I did it to make sure he knew that I was smarter than him. And I probably wasn't, actually. It's more red. And I agonized, and I agonized, and I agonized. I had an hour drive home, went to my hotel, and I couldn't sleep that night because I didn't know if he was any closer to the kingdom now, because what I had said. So it bothers me. I still think about it, and I choke up a little bit. And I know this is true of all of us. Ravi, same thing. He'll tell you that sometimes he's responded to a question of an antagonist, and it's bothered him all night. Not because that person offended him, because he's wondering, is that person further from Christ now or closer? And that's what governs me. Do I interact with people in a way that makes them further from Christ or closer? And if I get, now I'm not saying be a doormat. Don't be a doormat. But the culture is easily offended. You disagree with somebody, they get offended immediately. Just think to yourself, Christ said, forgive them, they're not what they do. How can I do anything less? How can I? Great question. Okay. So, here we go. No, go ahead. Well, I'll let you guys handle it. How about this? You guys with the microphones, you handle it. I can be the bad guy.
Hi, how's it going? My name's Caleb Baird. I just want to say thank you for coming because it was a very insightful speech that you gave.
Pleasure.
I'm a college student right now. I'm in my senior year at Grand Valley State University, so
Great.
I'm coming to the end. And one of those proud millennials. But my problem is that being a Christian in the millennial generation is something that's difficult. And I'm not sitting here and saying that, I deserve a pity party. But I'm saying that I think what I've noticed at the college campuses is that there is a overwhelming stifling of the students' ability to speak. And specifically on Grand Valley's campus, we're 96% privately funded. I think we only have 4% that's federal grant.
Yep.
And we sit on public land, but we have free speech zones which absolutely blow my mind, because we sit on public land, the university doesn't own it, but yet we have to apply to go and speak on something that we believe in. And if we don't, then we're stifled by the police department there and the faculty, and then we're kicked off, or are viewed as being disruptive to the education of the university. And so what I'm saying is that I've noticed that social media has given power to the younger generation at a much faster rate than it ever has before, and it actually gives them a platform to speak on. But what happens is that, and what I'm seeing is that there's an overwhelming majority of them are uneducated listeners, and what I mean by that is that they bite on the first thing that they see and hear, and they stick on that, and they bandwagon it. And that's very harmful, not only to them, but to the others that are using these social media platforms. And I'm not saying that social media is bad, but I'm saying that we have to be educated knowing that it's a living, breathing organism that's going to keep growing and morphing into something that's more challenging. So I guess what I'm saying is that, looking at the approach of social media and the younger generation and their control that they may or may not realize that they have, how do we institute those values back in families on educating those students coming into this new generation of having so much power and saying you have to be responsible at a much younger age than we ever had to be before?
Yep. Great questions and keen observation too. You're only an undergrad?
Yes, yeah, I'm a senior.
Wow, you're doing great. First word is that if you're not engaging in social media responsibly, then you're irrelevant. Sorry, you just are. As far as the younger generation goes. Now, I'm not saying you need to get a Facebook account tomorrow if you don't have one. I mean, my guess is you all do, or most of you do, because if the statistics are correct, almost all of us do. What I'm saying is that if you don't engage in it responsibly, the younger generation won't see it because they do have these bubbles, right? We have free speech zones. We have social media controlled stuff now too, and in fact, even with the algorithms that Facebook has, and Facebook and Twitter and all these other places have these algorithms now that they give you what you want. So if you click on a video, Facebook notices it, it says, great, we'll send him more like that, because this is what he wants. We're a customer service thing, we give the customer what he wants, and all these things. The problem is you begin to think that everyone thinks like you, because your friends all think like you, and every video you see is like, how in the world are they not getting this? That clearly the world is wrong, because look what I'm seeing on Facebook, everything agrees with me. Well, Facebook wants you to think that, because it's giving you what you want. You ever notice, this is a scary thing, you ever go on your Amazon app and look up a pair of shoes and don't buy it, and then you go to your Facebook app and there's an advertisement for those pair of shoes in your Facebook feed? Like, God must want me to buy these shoes. No, Facebook just knows what you do. So you gotta engage in it responsibly because it's not going anywhere, it's only gonna grow. But Abraham Lincoln said this wonderful phrase. He says, if you wanna test someone's integrity, you don't give them adversity, you give them power. Facebook is giving people power. Everyone's a journalist now, and no one's qualified. We don't check our sources. And by the way, we've all done this, so I'm not gonna ask you to raise your hand, but mentally raise your hand if you've seen an article that agrees with your position and then you shared it without reading it. Headline agree with your position, you didn't read the article. Happened when Obergefell was the decision of the United States, when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. I got a bunch of feeds and people saying, it didn't take long. They were reporting that homosexual activists had actually sued Zondervan and Thomas Nelson publishers for publishing the Bible. They said they're trying to ban the Bible for its homophobia. So I looked into it. It took me 3 minutes to find that this was all false. Yes, a guy did in fact sue those two publishers for their publication of the Bible, but not to get it banned. He claimed that they had mistranslated the verses on sexuality to be homophobic when they originally weren't homophobic. And he wanted emotional damages. He wasn't trying to ban anything. And he filed that in Michigan federal court. I happen to know the judge who decided that case. It was decided 3 weeks after it was filed as frivolous. And by the way, it wasn't filed after Obergefell. It was filed 7 years before Obergefell. So all the Christians I knew who had propagated the story had almost every fact wrong except that a lawsuit was filed. And that hurts. So we have to have this responsible engagement. I think as a young person who's engaged in it, you need to be on the forefront of responsible engagement, asking the why questions when things begin to flourish and people can actually bite on to bite on these clickbaits, is to be a responsible person and say, did you read the whole thing? And then read the whole thing. Oftentimes, this happens in scientific journals as well. The scientific journals will publish an article and it'll say, evidence for life on other planets. And then you'll look at the article and it says, well, if these conditions on this one exoplanet we found might be true, then it might be the case that this kind of thing might have developed. A lot of mights in there. The headline didn't say that, but we think that it says that. So you read the whole article and you realize this is all just speculation. So we can't go on the clickbait stuff. We have a responsibility to engage in social media very well. I also think that now free speech zones can be abused, but there is legal precedent for the idea of a free speech zone. It's called time, manner, and place restrictions within First Amendment law. I can't go into the middle. For example, during the church service today, if one of you stood up and just started spouting off, communist propaganda, you don't have the right to do that. You got to go in the right time, place, and manner. It has to be minimal restrictions, not total restrictions. Free speech zones sort of bump up against that a little bit, so we got to be careful with that. But be a voice. And I want to piggyback this on, I'm going to end my answer to your question on what John said. He goes 1 Peter 3:15 when he says, always be prepared to provide a reason for the hope you have within you. To anyone who asks, but do it with gentleness and with respect. Peter wrote that in the context of persecution. Now, I'm not saying we're all persecuted, because you go to China, that's persecution. You go to Iran, that's persecution. Here, it's just inconvenient. It might become persecution later, but now it's just inconvenient. But it says, provide a reason, a defense for the hope you have within you. Hope. Do you display hope? To anyone who asks, do you act so hopeful that people are like, what is with you? I want to know what you have that I don't have. But do it with gentleness and with respect. So you can do it on social media and you can do it in private conversations. But our work is cut out for us, very much so. And social media doesn't make it easy. But we have to engage in it responsibly. And I'm glad that someone your age is actually thinking about that stuff. Thank you very much.
I teach in a public school.
Is it?
Oh,
Back and
sure
forth, Ken.
is.
Crying out loud.
Thank you. I teach in a public school, and I teach a world comparative religions class. And I struggle when I get to the whole semester. I get panicked when I get to Islam, because I have all these beautiful Islamic children in my class.
Uh-huh.
And then I have students that are asking legitimate questions, a very safe space for those kids to ask that question.
Yep.
And when we get to topics of Sharia law, and talking about the lesser jihad, and talking about polygamy, I always panic when we have to answer those questions, because I want to make sure that these students sitting in my class feel safe sitting in my classroom. But having to answer some of the real questions about it, how do I do that?
Well, I guess it's a very tough one. A very tough one, because obviously, I think the first way to do it is to cite the answers from Islamic sources. And as a teacher, I'm sure with the lessons plans, they actually provide some of those for you.
I created the curriculum for the class.
Okay.
So there isn't anything really given to me. I mean, I have a college textbook that the kids have, but it's kind of over
What
their
grade?
head. Usually it's juniors and seniors.
Oh, okay, so it's a little more sophisticated. I thought you were like 6th grade or something
No,
like that.
no, it's
too.
high school.
Good.
It's high
Well,
school.
that's actually better, because in one sense, then you can like lay it out as it is and say, look, these are the sources. When you talk about polygamy, for example, quote the Quran on it. The Quran says that men can marry up to 4 wives. But if you fear unfairness, then restrain. Okay, that's what it says. Literally quote it. They can't get mad. Muslims can't get mad at you for quoting the Quran unless you do it out of context and just give the whole context. Will they ask questions about it? Well, it says it here. Harder questions might come though, like, well, what about can they beat their wives? And then you're like, well, in chapter 4, verse 34, it says that if you fear disobedience amongst your wife, with your wife, you can admonish her, scold her, then withhold sex, because that works. And then you can beat her if it still doesn't work. Now, most English translations will say you can beat her lightly. Well, okay, does that make it better? I mean, beat her, but not a lot. I mean, come on. But it says that. Now, you can quote the Quran on this. I think the way to do this is to say, look, don't go for the controversial topics. And by the way, Islam is not alone in polygamy, as you know. The LDS Church taught polygamy for the longest time. other religious systems teach polygamy. So it's not like, I mean, in Hinduism, they had a practice called sati. Sati is when they actually, when a man dies, they burn his body and they throw his live widow on top. That's in Hinduism. Okay, so Islam's not alone in this weirdness, right? Or this controversial stuff, I should say. So what I would say is that you quote from the sources, try to avoid the incendiary topics unless asked about it, but be prepared to be able to respond and say, okay, from Islamic sources, it does say these things. There are Muslims who don't practice this and who don't agree with this. If the Muslims ask a question, or they say, yeah, we don't believe da-da-da, great, let them have their voice. Now, you might end up disagreeing with it. And then here's what I would do too. I would actually engage in the Socratic method. You're a teacher, you know how this works. If someone says, well, that's what this says, but it was for a different time. Great, fantastic. You know, if you're from that background, can you teach us a little more? How did you come to that conclusion? Like, I just quoted what the Quran says, but you have a different interpretation. Can you give us a little more enlightenment on this? And then you might want to actually validate, not the answer itself, but the contribution by making that part of the test. When they do the exam on this stuff, say, they actually are one of the best sources about this because they're from that background. You'd be shockingly surprised to know how little Muslims know about Islam. It's like nominal Christians know very little about Christianity. So incorporate them into it a little bit. Maybe even meet with them ahead of time and say, hey, look, I'm teaching these things. I'm quoting from the Quran here. If you have anything you think could help me, I really appreciate it. So now you've included them into the conversation before you even get there. And so how can they get mad at you? You included them. You gave them an opportunity. It's a little more work for you, obviously, but I think it's worth it. And by the way, the fact that you care this much about the answers to these questions and these people shows me that I don't think you would even remotely shirk from the added effort to make sure these people see you as a Christian ambassador treating a different faith fairly. And that is the greatest witness I think you can do in a public school setting, is they can say, because a lot of Muslims, a lot of Hindus, a lot of atheists think this, Christians are unfair when they characterize us. And you can show them at least one example when it's not true. So do that. Can I do one more, or are we done?
I'm sorry, unfortunately, we only have this building for so long, so we have to stop here. But I think, Abdu, are you okay if people have a question, they can stop up and see you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to be going very, very shortly. I have a wife and kids to go see. But
thank you for your questions. I feel like this could go on all day long, but thank you very much, Abdu.
Thanks, guys.